Healing Wisdom is made possible by members like you and sustaining members like Michael Brabowski. You can become a sustaining member of WOMR for as little as $15 a month. For more information, call 508-487-2619 or visit our website at WOMR.org, where you can learn more about legacy gifts and planned giving. You're tuned in to 92.1 WOMR FM Provincetown and 91.3 WFMR FM Orleans, the voice and spirit of Cape Cod. I bid you welcome to another episode of Healing Wisdom. I'm your host, Pandora Peoples, chartered herbalist and psychic medium. Healing Wisdom explores mind, body, soul connections as we discuss the healing effects of the arts, metaphysical concepts, intuition, and the spiritual aspects of everyday living. Healing Wisdom begins in the heart. Our theme music is provided by Mystic Pete. We welcome today Dr. Chip Thomas, aka Jetsonorama. I'm really excited to hear firsthand about your trip across Africa. I know that was some decades ago, but I just think that is just the coolest thing. And we're going to talk a little bit about COVID and how it's affected the Navajo Nation and where you are in your clinic there. It sounds like it's very busy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
So you're a photographer, a public artist, and a primary healthcare physician, and you coordinated the Painted Desert Project. So since 2009, you've been pasting enlarged photographs on various structures. So can you talk about your mission behind this work and then how it evolved or sort of morphed into this Painted Desert Project and why you chose this medium?
Yeah, well, right. So let's see. Where to begin? I came to the Navajo Nation, to Nebekea, northern Arizona in 1987. I had a 4-year scholarship. The federal government paid for my medical school education. And I knew that I would have to work in a health shortage area upon completion of my medical training. And a dear, dear friend from medical school named Peggy Crawley was working here with her husband. She's a physician. And so I was invited to come work here. And so I came in 87. My next door neighbor at the time was a dentist, great fellow, still a close friend of mine. His name is Ken Ogawa. And Ken had a black and white darkroom. And I'd been shooting black and white since junior high school, but I never really knew what I was doing in terms of actually exposing the camera. And I had gone into a dark room once before. So I decided, I don't know if you know the expression shedding or wood shedding from the jazz community. Yeah, it's a great term. So Sonny Rollins is a great example of this, tenor saxophonist who I think in the 60s it was that he literally dropped out of the jazz scene in New York, went away to the countryside for, I don't know what period of time, but months. And, came back like fully formed and having moved his art form to a different level. So being kind of isolated away on the Navajo Nation, it really has been an opportunity to engage curiosities and passions that I have, like how to properly expose a camera, how to develop film. So as often as possible, I go out into the community and spend time with people to, just hear their stories and appreciate what their lives are like. And to the extent possible, I've photographed and come back, go straight to the darkroom. And I did that for 22 years, but I've always had a passion for street art, so I started my family practice residency in West Virginia in 1983. Which isn't that far from New York City. In 83, in fact, I think it was 83 that the movie Beach Street came out. I don't know if that means anything to you or anyone in your audience, but and I think a year before that, Wild Style came out. So these are like hip hop classics. But it was an introduction to the country, to the world, really, of this new art form that was emerging in New York City of, emceeing, breakdancing, and graffiti art. So I would travel from West Virginia to New York City looking for painted walls, looking for painted trains, going to gallery shows. So there was always a love for street art. But I came out here, I pursued black and white photography. And then, well, since you mentioned the bike trip, yeah, I'd been here for 5 years and I got a call one day that seemed somewhat random, asking if I was interested in being the team physician for a bicycle trip from the top of Africa, 12,000 miles to the bottom. Did it. But every 5 to 6 years after that, I try to take time away from where I live and work here in northern Arizona in Dinebekea to travel to different parts of the world, to get out of my comfort zone. In 2009, I was in Brazil for 3 months, fell in with a community of people making street art, and they showed me work online of the French artist J.R., who had done an amazing installation in Rio the year before in 2008 with women's faces and eyes pasted onto a favela, Providencia, I think. Yeah, so I saw that, and that was like a game changer for me because someone had bridged, the world of black and white photography with large scale street art. And when I came back from that trip, I just, was burning with a passion to figure that out.
Just going to like the LA Museum of Art and Modern Museum of Contemporary Art in downtown LA, and growing up going to see all these installation works, I was just like really fascinated. And then, in Los Angeles, there's a lot of mural artists, and I would just be so happy every time I would like turn a corner and see either a lot of beautiful graffiti or, a combination of like art and graffiti, and a lot of like, some people have wondered about your art because sometimes it winds up on places where there's graffiti and it's like there's a question of whether it's like which came first, and yeah, I mean, it's just really beautifies the place, and it really stands out, especially with a natural background like such.
Yeah.
In the case with your art, it's pretty amazing. So
yeah, well, thanks for that. But I just want to follow up on something you said real quickly. I mean, I think that's one of the things that really resonated deeply with me visiting Brazil for the first time in 2004 was, there's just in many of the cities of Brazil, there's an abundance of street art. So I was blown away initially just by the volume of art. And it isn't, I mean, there's pintação, which is stylized writing. But so it isn't all figurative, but so the quality of the work also impressed me, and the fact that the city government seemed to tolerate it struck me. But the thing that really resonated with me was just the way I felt whenever I saw it. It just felt like this place is dynamic. This place, has a certain energy. And yeah, so it literally spoke to me.
Well, it's constantly evolving, right? I mean, in Venice, they actually made, where I was born, they have a skate park now, actually, but it used to just be like dilapidated, rundown buildings that people would be spray painting on. But they have this evolving few walls where people are just constantly reinventing it. And it's a cool community that people, feel welcome to the space.
Yeah.
What part of Brazil was this?
Well, yeah. So, it's funny too, because like even as a kid, I remember watching Pele play soccer, for the Brazilian national team on black and white TV. And then going out and chasing a ball around by myself, pretending to be Pele. And this was when I was in primary school. And then I remember the first coming of bossa nova in the early 60s, so there's always been just a resonance with me with Brazil. So let's see, the first time I went in 2004, I spent a few days in Rio, but then pretty quickly went up to Bahia, to Salvador. But the music form that really touches me is maracatu, which comes from Recife and Olinda, which is north of Salvador. And yeah, so those are the main parts that I visited. Maracatu is interesting in that the dance form and the rhythm apparently have a strong connection. I want to say to the Congo in Southwest Africa, and the the enslaved people of Brazil in the 1800s would make costumes and pretend to be members of the Portuguese court because, Brazil was colonized by several countries, but most recently Portugal. And they would dress up and parade and appear to be people of the Portuguese court, but really had the positions of African royalty represented with flag bearers and the king, the queen. They danced and drummed to a rhythm. The first time I heard it actually was during Carnival in Bahia, 2004, and it starts with an instrument called the gongue, which is two cowbells of different pitches. And the first time I heard that, I got goosebumps, and it was like I had to find out what this rhythm is. Yeah.
Could you talk about your mission to bring people together a little more? Because I know that's really important to you. And I know that you kind of took your background as a physician working with people and being inside the community and photographing them and it being like a very intimate experience.
Yeah, okay. And I'll try to stay on point here. Right. So I started my public art project 2009, but nationally and internationally there were mural festivals or public art festivals happening in different places. One of the ones that really intrigued me was called the Underbelly Project, where an artist by the name of a conceptual artist by the name of Jordan Sealer. And I don't know if RJ Rushmore was one of the curators for that. I can't think of the name of the blog, the street art blog that Vandalog, yeah. So anyway, these guys, over the course of a year, invited street artists from all over the world to come to New York City, and then they would sneak them down to an abandoned subway station. So it was part, urban exploration and mural making, but it was all done underground during the night. And then at the end of about a year, Jordan and I think RJ, the other curator, led just a handful of journalists. I think the guys from Brooklyn Street Art, Jaime and Steve, were amongst the few journalists who were allowed to go down and see this project. So that was one project of inviting artists that caught my imagination. Another one was called the Boneyard Project, and that was actually done in Tucson. There's an Air and Space Museum where the Boneyard itself actually is a reference to a place where out in the desert, vintage World War II and I guess more recent airplanes that are no longer in use are left in the desert to just deteriorate. But as a fundraising program, curators or the director of the Air and Space Museum partnered with a curator out of New York City to invite street artists from all over the world to come and paint murals on these airplanes. And then they charge people to see it and raise money. So I had a fascinating opportunity in my middle school years. I went to a very, very small alternative Quaker boarding school, and the whole emphasis of this was on building community, identifying interests and talents of people within the community, and then, trying to figure out a way to bring those resources together to improve the community for everyone, right? So I was talking with a friend at the time, and we actually came up with this idea about the same time. And, it's like, hey, why don't we invite some of our favorite street artists to the Navajo Nation, have them come out, spend some time, and paint murals on roadside stands. Because what I learned in putting my pictures on these roadside stands was that I live between the Grand Canyon and the Monument Valley, so there's a lot of tourist traffic. And vendors were telling me that more tourists were stopping if there was art on these stands. So that's how the Painted Desert Project started, with the purpose of trying to find people in the community who were interested in learning muralism and having an opportunity to mentor or be mentored by some of the visiting artists. And that has been happening, not to the extent that I would like, but there was one artist in particular, Daniel Josley, who is a neighbor of mine actually here on the reservation, who is quite an outstanding muralist who worked with several of the artists that I brought out. Yeah, we've also had artists come out and spend time in local schools, leading workshops and meeting with groups of students here on the nation during the summer as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're trying to spread the love and spread art.
Well, the art is fabulous, and folks can see your work at your website, Jetsonorama.net. One of your exhibitions was Unsilenced, Indigenous Enslavement in Southern Colorado. Can you talk about the Indigenous people's enslavement in America? Because it's really not a widely known story. And, in the West for years after the Civil War, after African heritage people were freed, Indigenous Americans continued to be held in captivity. So you tell the story of Lafayette Head, which I think is just a really remarkable story.
Let me preface all of this by saying if anyone has any interest in this topic, there are a couple books that come to mind. One of them is Captives and Cousins by historian James Brooks. And this one really focuses more on Native enslavement in the Southwest, a more comprehensive book that looks at the enslavement of Native people in the Americas from the time of the Columbus expedition, 1492, actually up to present day. Debt peonage, sex trafficking is a book by Andreas Resendez called The Other Slavery, which is just has a wealth of information. So yeah, I mean, the short of my involvement in this project is there is a fort in southern Colorado that was built in 1858, I believe, may have been 1853. It's called Fort Garland. Interestingly, it's at the foot of one of the sacred mountains for the Dene. It's Mount Blanca. But yeah, so in the 1850s, the Colorado Gold Rush, for example, started in 1859. So there was more westward expansion. The Manifest Destiny principle was in full effect. And as settlers came west, they were basically taking land and animals that had been hunted by Native people from them. And then, we're trying to get the support of the federal government to protect them from Native people who were trying to maintain their way of life. So this fort was built, and so there was a campaign. I don't know how much of this history folks know, but 1864, Kit Carson, I forget his rank in the U.S. Army at the time, led a campaign, pretty brutal campaign against the Dene here, where he, in order to move people out of the way so settlers could settle and keep going west to California, rounded the Dene up and force marched people 300 to 400 miles from here to southern New Mexico and placed them in a very small, basically prison camp for about 3 or 4 years. And actually, one of the first examples of scorched earth, of a scorched earth military campaign, was practiced by the U.S. cavalry against the Dene when their crops were all burned and people were, starved, so they would be forced marched to the camp of enslavement. But one of the things that was happening as people were being forced marched to the Bosque Redondo in southern New Mexico is warring tribes of the Dene were basically poaching people to be sold into bondage. And unlike African slavery and Native enslavement, there's always been an emphasis on children and women. The nature of the work is different. The work that was done by enslaved Native people was more around the homestead, as opposed to, being out in the fields from Cancy to Cancy. So what happened in southern New Mexico is the fort was built. Lafayette Head, as you said, had migrated to southern. Actually, he migrated first to New Mexico, to Abiquiu. But anyway, he was there. He was like a trader and a trading post, and he was interacting primarily with the Ute tribe, with members of the Ute tribe. And he went on to be, 1853, I know he moved from Abiquiu to southern Colorado to a town called Conejos. And he moved with 50 Mexican families and they settled the area. And during that time, he became the Indian agent, kind of the federal overseer for the Jicarilla Apache, as well as a band of Utes. And okay, so we're talking now about the 1860s. 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing African slaves. The Civil War had started 1861, it stopped 1865. So about the time the Civil War stopped, President Andrew Johnson was hearing about the enslavement of Native people in the Southwest and asked all the Indian agents in the Southwest to do a survey in their respective counties of all the enslaved Native people. Interestingly, the only agent to follow through with this assignment was Lafayette Head. So he did a survey for two counties, Costilla County and Conejos County in southern Colorado, and came up with a total of about 142 names of enslaved people, which was submitted to Andrew Johnson. And in so doing, the first time he turned the report in, he did not include any of the enslaved people in his own household or the household of his friends and neighbors, which was later corrected in the second version of the survey. So I was introduced to this ledger, the survey that was created by Lafayette Head by the former historian for the state of New Mexico, Esteban Real Galvez. And his brother Ronald is an architect who's known as Adobe Ron because his specialty is building adobe buildings. And but he's also attempting to identify historic adobe buildings in southern Colorado, purchase them and restore them. And one of the places he purchased or he identified was the home of Lafayette Head, which was the agency for the Jicarilla Apache and the Utes. So Ron and Esteban took me and showed me the home of Lafayette Head, and attached to it was a small building, which they speculated was the home of the enslaved people. But they also showed me Esteban showed me on his phone, and Ron may have had a tablet or a copy of the list that Head sent to President Johnson in 1865. And the thing that struck me was how beautifully it was written. It turns out that Head's mother was a school teacher in a one-room schoolhouse in Missouri, and her children and kids, she emphasized penmanship. And, so you've got this really elaborately written document of the names of the captive enslaved people, their ages, their sex, what tribe they were bought from. And one of the other things that I thought was especially poignant in this list was the question that was asked, willingness to return to tribe. And a remarkable number of people, anywhere from ages, say, 4 on this list to maybe age 44, 64, there were some fairly old people. 3/4 of them said no, they were not willing to return to their tribe, which was confusing for me. And I asked the an historian at Fort Garland by the name of Eric Carpio, who is the museum director. And he made a really good point. It's like, we have no idea what the circumstances were when that question was asked to an enslaved person. We don't know who else was in the room, what eye contact was or was not being made to say, you better answer this question correctly. But yes, I mean, just the, I don't know, the having an opportunity to tell an historical story like this using artifacts from that period in the home of Kit Carson. Well, that was the fascinating thing as well. So Kit Carson, like I said, was at Fort Garland from 66 to 1868. He was just there for 18 months, but he was there with his Dene son, whose name was Juan, and his wife, Josefa, who got Juan in exchange for a horse. Apparently, that wasn't uncommon. But Juan was there at the fort with his dad, Kit Carson, during the 18 months he was there. So for 69 years at the museum, at Fort Garland Museum, there was in the commandant's quarters where Kit Carson lived, there was an exhibition that had, like a mannequin of him sitting at a desk, signing some official documents. But every room in this building was devoted to the life and times of Kit Carson. So the museum decided they wanted to decenter the settler colonial narrative and focus more on people from around the community. So they did away with everything related to Kit Carson, because what was happening was many people who look like you in this community, who had heard all of their lives that they were of Spanish descent from the conquistadors or of Mexican descent from the 1800s, were getting DNA swabs done and getting results back indicating that they were 1/16 or 1/8 Native, and not knowing anything about this because they'd always been led to believe they were, Spanish or Mexican. So conversations were starting to happen within families of, several generations ago, there was this captive person in our family. So the museum did a series of listening sessions where they asked people from the community. They did these listening sessions via Zoom to share some of these stories, to bring pictures forward, and to have an opportunity to, I guess, address some of this intergenerational trauma, but also this hidden history, with the purpose of doing an exhibition about it. And I was very fortunate to be asked to take part in this project.
A new study published in Science Direct estimates that 56 of the 60 million pre-Columbian indigenous people in the Americas were killed by European diseases and violence by 1600. And that's about 10% of the world population at the time. So as a physician serving the Navajo Nation, what are your thoughts on how strains of COVID have impacted indigenous populations? So what are you seeing at your clinic, and what are some of the unique challenges that you face being on the reservation?
It's almost not a fair question. There's so much to unpack, and I'll try to be concise. Whenever I talk about being here, I appreciate that a lot of people I talk with don't necessarily know a lot about this area. So let me just take a step back and do a quick overview. The Navajo Nation is 27,000 square miles in size, is larger than the state of West Virginia, is home to roughly 180,000 people, so it's not densely populated. Scattered over the 27,000 square miles, there are 13 full-service supermarkets, something other than a quick pick. But it was determined that what is being sold in those 13 supermarkets, over 80% of it has little to no nutritional value. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is that on the nation, there is coal, oil, natural gas, uranium, and water and aquifers, and also timber. But with these natural resources, one would think that the streets would be paved with gold. that there would just be an abundance of material wealth here. But because the reservation is treated very much like a colony, the wealth of the nation is in countries elsewhere because, there are multinational corporations taking advantage of these resources. So as I talk to you, roughly 25% of my patients still don't have running water or electricity.
We've been speaking with physician and photographer and street artist, Dr. Chip Thomas. This is part 1 of 2. You've been listening to Healing Wisdom, a Thursday morning weekly show featuring guests who share their journeys and expertise, providing us with food for thought. I'm your host, Pandora Peoples, Reiki and shamanic practitioner. You can find Healing Wisdom podcasts at WOMR.org or on Facebook and Instagram pages. We're listening to O Mashe Bello from Alessandro Esposito. You can find his music at soundcloud.com/Alessandro-Esposito-10.